I want to be the best there ever was, to beat all the rest, yeah, that's my cause.
Only time for
While developing for the original Pokemon Red and Green, Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri apparently had the option of creating a secondary save file for the games, but chose not to. His reason? He wanted the player to be able to fill up their PC with Pokemon and nickname all of them. It seems like a trivial reason, I know, but it says a lot about the philosophy of Pokemon back then. They wanted the player to have the most unique experience possible while playing the game, even if it meant that they could name their Pokemon Poop Rocket or Butt Monkey. Of course, that was back in the day when the data structure was so limited that they had to make that choice. Nowadays, they can cram 907 3D Pokemon models, a bunch of character models, some move animations, and all the nicknames you'll ever want into a 3.6GB 3DS file. But they stuck to the whole one save file thing because it would probably screw up the formula too much if they changed it. That's kind of what Pokemon's always been about. Formulas. Be it the insane math problems that calculate catching a Pokemon, or the in-game mechanics that have prevailed for 20 plus years. But now they're wanting to change things for the worse. On February 27, 2019, the 23rd anniversary of Red and Green's release, Tsunekazu Ishihara officially announced the 8th generation of Pokemon, beginning with Pokemon Sword and Shield. The fans were excited. New starters, a new region that looked like England, cool new graphics, and maybe some lore. After the quick-time event-driven Gen 7 games and the $60 Pokemon Go add-on that was Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, a new real Pokemon game would be a breath of fresh air. Fast forward a few months to June 5th, 2019. E3 time! New Pokemon get revealed. It looks like there's going to be a multiplayer feature that looks sort of like Pogo raid battles, and Pokemon Kaiju battles seem to be the new gimmick. The Direct seems to go over well, typical Pokemon stuff, new legendaries, yada yada yada. Then came the biggest shock of them all. The snap.
What did you do? What did you do?
The only Pokemon you could get in Sword and Shield were Pokemon that were already available in Sword and Shield, which would be like if Amazon only allowed you to buy stuff you already owned. A resounding, "Wait, what?" filled the halls of the internet. Junichi Masuda later confirmed this, and confirmed that moving forward, they weren't going to make any more Pokemon games where you could use all of the Pokemon. Naturally, fans were upset. They took to Twitter to tweet their outrage. The word Dexit was soon coined. When asked why they chose to do this, Masuda claimed that they wanted to keep room for high-quality animations and to better balance the game. Fans were quick to point out the flaws in this logic. Other fans did some data mining on the older 3D Pokemon games, specifically Sun and Moon. The mine showed that Game Freak kinda sucked at programming their own games, and some theorized that they just didn't know how to make Sword and Shield work due to optimization issues. But that brings us back to the larger problem at hand. Ever since Diamond and Pearl's Pallet Park, it's been kind of a given that you could send your Pokemon across time and space to experience the new regions with you. As movesets changed, you could still import old moves from older games to make for a more interesting experience. In fact, someone at Smogon actually did the math. With the possible Pokemon available in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, you could theoretically have an actual Googleplex of different options. Think of the biggest number in your head, and then add about 100 zeros. That's the amount of options you had in making a Pokemon team, and Game Freak just crippled that. Let's take things way back to about 20 years ago. Game Freak was in the process of making Ruby and Sapphire, but they weren't able to send Pokemon from the Gen 2 games forward to Gen 3. As there were too many differences between the hardware and the software of the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance, trading was going to be downright impossible. So they decided to leave all of the data for all 386 Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire, and they began developing Fire Red and Leaf Green. With those games and Emerald, you could capture basically every Pokemon possible at the time. Plus, that began the trend of remaking older games as a counterpart to the new Pokemon generation games, and that resulted in the best two Pokemon games ever made. A few years later, with the intergenerational transfer tool of Pokemon Bank, Game Freak even managed to stop obviously hacked Pokemon from getting to the 3DS easily, and they managed to add an even crazier feature that made the competitive field even more interesting, transferring Pokemon from the first 7 games to Gen 7. So, by the end of Gen 7, you had the option of taking the team you worked on in Ruby almost 20 years ago. and pitting them against newer Pokemon with newer mechanics, as well as older Pokemon with older movesets. While I know times have changed for Pokemon since Gen 3, the fact remains that they once worked under the philosophy of making it work and making it awesome. Plus, there's no way this is down to just a space issue. The preloads show that Sword and Shield is about 10 gigabytes in size. The Nintendo Switch cartridges were about 32 gigabytes in size before they switched to 64 gigabytes this year, and the Switch itself is capable of using up to 2 terabytes in expandable memory through SD cards. So, if it's specifically a software issue, why didn't they just outsource the game's development? Better yet, why didn't they just insource it? They have a secondary company that started up for the sole purpose of creating the first 3D Pokemon RPGs on a home console. No, I'm not talking about Sword and Shield, I'm talking about Colosseum. In 2001, a bunch of veteran game developers who worked on the Dragon Quest games formed Genius Sonority for the sole purpose of making home console Pokemon RPGs. Plus, they were joined by Creatures Inc., the company that worked on a ton of 3D side games for Pokemon, including but not limited to Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, Detective Pikachu, and Pokemon Go. These guys even helped Game Freak make the jump from 2D to 3D with Pokemon X and Y. Not to mention that these guys are really capable of making those high quality animations.
That hurt. That's a hit this time.
Before the decimation, Game Freak had announced Pokemon Home, a hub of sorts that will connect Sword and Shield to Pokemon Bank, Pokemon Go, and Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. This added what looked like even more options to the game, but the announcement of Dexit completely slashed those plans. Keep in mind, transfer from the aforementioned sources was one way. You wouldn't be able to send them back if you wanted to. This essentially meant that a lot of your Pokemon were going to be stuck in a digital purgatory, a lot like the countless Wonder Traded Pokemon that you never bothered to release, except you wouldn't be able to access them outside of home ever again. The most damning of these revelations came from the collection of leaks that surfaced recently. The Galar Pokedex was going to be limited to these Pokemon, which actually renders the Let's Go games mostly useless, unless you actually played it for the neutered story or strictly use it for Pokemon Go, seeing as 60% of its dex is unable to be sent to the new games. Even Meltan, the only real reason to buy the Let's Go games in the first place, is locked out of Sword and Shield. Even more annoying is that their crazy addition of access to the first 7 games is now mostly useless, seeing as only 88 of the available 251 Pokemon from those games would be usable. It's weird that they would make such a big deal out of that just to drop the ball on the whole concept only 2 years later. At any rate, Pokemon is the most profitable media franchise on the planet. While I know they don't have $95 billion lying around, they still shouldn't be hurting for cash. They have the resources to make this game as good as possible, including a ton of money in 2 secondary studios who are really experienced at making 3D Pokemon games, but they blew it for no good reason. Really, they should have just gone for a hard reboot if they wanted to make changes this drastic. After all, that's what they're doing with the anime series, which makes sense seeing as most of Ash Ketchum's Pokemon wouldn't be allowed in the Galar region. Either that or delay the release of the game to ensure it'll be good, because as the great and powerful Shigeru Miyamoto once said, a delayed game is eventually good, but a bad game is bad forever. To sum this little spiel up, I don't intend on buying these games. I think I'm just going to replay Emerald instead. I'm Grand Moff Puppet, and I thank you for listening.